could also be from a character level, so that when you do engage it, it builds out the backstory. And if you're in something that's so complex, you can also play with some of whatever the believability pieces are, even in your own mind. Maybe there's a glitch in, say, the Matrix or something. But if you had control over the first person's way of viewing the world, you could also rewrite stuff as far as the way someone is viewing it and make them remember or disremember, and things like that. So, but interesting as far as the different characters that kind of follow their way through life, of the way you interact with them. Maybe it's not, hey, it's me, Mario. It's good seeing you again, Steven, because you already know that it's Mario because of his distinguished accent and mustache.
And the time we've spent together.
Right.
Right? Like
Right.
if I came up to you and I said, hello, my name is Steven, it would be kind of nonsensical, wouldn't it? Mm-hmm. Right? And probably quite disappointing.
Right.
Right?
Right. So,
Yeah.
and I think that speaks to the dumbness, in the nicest sense of the word, of these systems. So, just like a news broadcast is broadcasting to millions of people, a game is as well. It's built to appeal to a number of people so that it can support the creation of the game in the first place. So if you played a game that happened to include unicorns and Teslas and turtles, and that only appeals to you because that just happens to be you or a small subset of the market, in today's day and age, that may not make sense. But in a world where you could just generate AI creations or games or things of that nature very quickly based on personal preference, that may be the most sensible thing to do because it would keep you engaged with the game the longest. So I think those things are interesting, and I keep jumping back to this, but it is pretty limitless as far as when you can generate these things that have typically taken years to generate on a production level before you get that response from the consumer. And by the way, the response now is more on a broad level. What are the ratings based on the millions or hundreds of thousands of people that looked at it versus the response of the individual itself, and then your ability to then iterate on that, I think totally changes the way we create these things and develop them out. So it could be very fun. It also could be very scary where this all goes. I guess part of it is you wonder who's at the helm of some of these things, and just based on the current condition of humans, there's a time horizon there. So just like fortunes are lost through generations of misuse and mishandling, you could see organizations, as we have in the past, deteriorate as far as from a value standpoint, right? You could say that the intentions of Elon Musk and his view on certain things are trustworthy based on his past actions. But the person after Elon Musk, barring some kind of advancement in healthcare that allows people to live much longer, can take the same system that works so well for a society and kind of turn it on its head and drive it into a new form of hell.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. So, so going back to Max's book, again, Life 3.0, right? What do you think were one of the sections that kind of jumped out at you?
Let's see here. Well, I think one thing that was interesting, and I've seen him talk about this several different times, is the intelligence of some of these maybe stupid systems that are out there. And he references planes that were driven into the side of mountains by suicidal pilots, or even, let's say, the Boeing incidents that happened where these planes essentially would nosedive, and things like that. Whereas you could bake in some kind of intelligence into everyday items so that they're not just an aircraft, but an aircraft with a just general set of guidelines, like never land in a way that would risk human life, right? Or something like that. So, how would you take that same idea of and just apply it to other things, right? Like cars, for instance, buildings, things like that, that there's more of an intelligence that the the object and its place in society and function has another layer of identity, right? A table is great for holding food and drinks, but if you slip and fall and your head happens to hit the corner of it, it's now a weapon, right? Or it's at least potentially hurt you because it's a weapon. So I guess we're not asking tables to rotate to avoid your fall. But there's other kind of more physical precautions you could take as far as design, to maybe round the corners or soften the corners or whatever it might be, right? Of course you can't. There's like a certain amount of there's like if you're going to invest your time in developing anything, tables that move and avoid falls are probably the lowest on the list versus on the other side, planes that know not to descend into mountains. So there's probably a trade-off there between attention and all to those sorts of issues. But I think there's definitely places where those investments would make a lot of sense to avoid some of those catastrophes. We're also looking at there's some conditions that you can maybe not correct, right? So a plane you could maybe instruct or signal some kind of something that would stop something catastrophic. But let's say a rocket that is bound by the laws of physics and the ability based on the propellant and the angle of the wind and the landing pad and things like that may have harder rules or to enforce through a system to ensure that it doesn't do something catastrophic, right? It could be a few degrees of descent that are off. Calculations could be off. A certain gust or environmental change, could essentially throw the whole thing off. Where no system baked into it would be able to, solve for those issues. But that was something that stuck out to me. But what about yourself? Were there any?
No, I think that's interesting, and I do think the discussion about the plane example, right, and giving objects a certain level of knowledge, right, which kind of introduces another question when we think about that knowledge, i.e., in intelligence, what we would ascribe to a plane, right, that would not allow a pilot to fly it into a mountain, right, is some level of, understanding of, there's a lot of understanding baked into that. First of all, what is in a mountain, right? Why would it be non-optimal for a plane to fly into a mountain, right? What are, what are best efforts made to avoid the possibility of flying into a mountain, et cetera. And it's interesting to think about it when we talk about artificial intelligence, right? What is the difference between an inanimate object that has some form of a protective fail-safe, right? Meaning that, so for example, if you take a microwave, right? You can't, put your head in a microwave and turn it on, right? The non-intelligent fail-safe will just simply not allow it to operate unless the door is closed, right? And you can't have it both ways, obviously closing a door while your head is in the microwave. But yet in the plane example, right, that's something different than a simple fail-safe. Right?
And by the way, that's not even that intelligent, right?
Sure.
If you had a big enough microwave that you could fit in, or put something small enough that fit within its cavity, there's nothing inside of it that ties itself to what is wrong or right. But sorry, go ahead.
No, understood. Well said. Right. So then, I guess the question becomes, in a different way, kind of opening this up to really, using this example, when you say that is not that intelligent, what do we truly mean by intelligence in some of these, guide rail examples, right? That are more than just, you can't close a microwave door when, the door simply can't be closed, right?
Right. And I think that really ties itself to what is the intention or the values of the person using it, right? A missile flying towards your enemy is aligns with the value of the offensive, but does the opposite for the place of the incoming missile, right? So being able to then distinguish from those different things, and right, that's where conflict kind of throws it askew, because if those same systems are used but against other humans, the guideline cannot be that this missile will never kill a human. It is that it will only kill a specific human who happens to disagree or have a different value or be after or going after some value that you hold dear, right? And you could argue that both sides see that their values being worth enough to die over or to risk losing civilians over, or soldiers. So that's where I think it becomes tough. He does talk a little bit about cyberwar and different arms races and things like that. I mean, you could imagine just with, again, current technologies today, like for instance, drones, right? If you had a swarm of, let's say, 1 billion drones that all had explosives on them and also face recognition, you could take over an entire country, and people could in any way, maybe with electromagnetic bombs or something like that, try to then get rid of them. But there's so many pieces of the swarm that and they're potentially very cheap to manufacture, that it could just be a completely new way of warfare, and a very targeted way of warfare. So I think those things are potentially scary as well. I mean, AI in many ways, because its ability to then think and process information much faster than everyday people, and doesn't need the time to digest information, doesn't need to sleep, eat shit, and everything that humans have to deal with, for better or worse. I think there's many ways that this could potentially not end up in the way that maybe people are wanting. But the problem there is that once the genie's out of the box, or whatever the saying is, how do you put it away, right? Do you produce movies and films and drone armies, and then one day just decide, I'd actually like to take 2 years to film something and deal with all the complexities of the old way of creating films? Or do you say, this is just the way that it's done and it's way more efficient? So you could look at, you could almost consider your body itself to be some sort of like a self-regulated, non-conscious operation that works well. So you eat food and your body derives the energy, does what it needs to with the ingredients and nutrients, and discards the rest without you having to think about it. And that's an intelligent system that happens to work. So then we can focus and spend our time doing anything else we want. So there's a question of, once you remove some of the creative production, some of these other things that you have to consciously think about today, what do you end up thinking about and doing with your life, right? With the time you have. And, there's also the potential that there's, is there anything left for you to be good at or to do when everything else has been resolved? People will go today and buy something that's handmade, but it's more so of a novelty versus something that just works from a operational standpoint, right? So I think those are interesting conundrums that we're going to run into. From a war perspective, who knows what the future looks like? You just hope to hell it's not 1984.
Sure. Absolutely. And we can come back to the concept of 1984 and AI, but going back to what you were saying earlier about, human labor and the creation of, something handmade, right? Mm-hmm. What do we see, and both hinted at in this book, and I think a central question, with the emergence of things like ChatGPT, et cetera, right? Where do we see AI being, disruptive in the present job market, right? Of say the next 10 or 15 years, right? And how do you think that will look like, right? Is it all pessimism, or is there room for optimism as well?
Well, I think short term, there's always going to be pessimism, because a lot of the advancements are going to then disrupt what the current reality is today. So let's think of just something today that's much more efficient because of a computer, right? The computer initially came up as someone who would compute and actually do those computations, whether through calculator or by hand, whatever it might be. And those people are out of jobs because it doesn't make any sense, right? But no one today is complaining about that because there are no computers to defend because those people are now doing other things. It does get a little bit difficult thinking about what happens to a whole entertainment industry when no one there is no longer needed. It's not feasible from an economic level, which drives the reason for being. So, you could have some artificial things that slow that down, right? Like you could have, potentially unions or governments stand in and limit the ability for that to expand, like you've seen with a lot of maybe some of the more biological engineering and mutation and cloning and things like that, because you'll have groups that then push back on that. But maybe the good and the bad is that there's different countries that around the world that work in their own ecosystems, and each one has their different level of restrictions on certain types of engineering and things of that. So maybe you want to learn how to create a superhuman by manipulating DNA and running tests, and in one country it's seen as immoral and unethical, and in another that is maybe in need of economic investment and things of that will turn another way in order to let that kind of research be developed. So it's in some source outsourcing your guilt. But as far as from an employment standpoint, I mean, is there an example, or other than maybe the entertainment industry, where you could see whole industries potentially be wiped out just because of the inefficiencies that will be presented?
Right. And when we say the word wiped out, I think we need to be careful there, because disruption doesn't always mean, or I would argue probably the majority of the time doesn't necessarily mean wiped out as such, but fundamentally changed, perhaps, right? And I can think of a variety of different industries beyond entertainment. I mean, we've talked about journalism, right? Certainly, education, ed tech, the ability to scale, right? Educational environments down to the individual pupil level, right? Mm-hmm. That would go far beyond what a present-day teacher could do. Particularly in the lower grade levels, right? With a class of 15 to 35 students, say, right?
Well,
yeah.
Maybe we can talk about education a little bit. And I've had a few thoughts on this, but I think most people can remember who their favorite teacher is, and sometimes it's not the subject that's they find the most interesting, but how that information is presented. So, why in today's age, when you've got teachers all over the country and the world, is it not possible to find that best teacher, put them in some kind of education platform that then they could teach every single individual, across the world that same information, and inspire and push them along? And you might say, well, okay, we're not going to wipe out all the other teachers because, they could actually be of use and more of a kind of like teacher's assistant level, where they're actually assisting and supporting that information. But I think that becomes a good opportunity to say, if we have an education problem where some people will typically on a bell curve rise to the top of the class and flunk their way out of school, but is that a reflection of the teachers in place or the environment in which those children are raised, or whatever it might be, right? So I think you'd want to potentially take the best approach, which would be take the best teachers you can from anywhere in the world, who teach every given subject and make every day something fun. You talked a little earlier about gamification and a little bit, and as far as different games and how that may evolve. So maybe instead of learning about physics through reading a book and looking at graphs and formulas and drawings, you're in some way learning that through actually being on site and watching whatever that is actually happen. So you watch the physics of a cannonball based on because you filled that cannon ball with a certain amount of gunpowder, and you're able to, through some form of game, actually play with that and get some kind of data in response to what you're doing. So if people have long said, or at least people who are more crafty, I guess, would say they learned a lot by taking things apart. So you take a microphone apart and you see where the noise vibrates, something that turns that signal into something digital that then can be replayed somewhere else. So creating games as a form of education that then teach you by dismantling and a different series of methods of having a more intimate view with whatever the subject matter. Sitting in a room that happens to just house, other classmates, and then referencing, text and images is one way to learn. But being either through videos or games or whatever it might be, able to interact with those in a more optimal way of learning, right? And today that's not really possible because you can't take every student in the world or America to a launch site and have them do that. But through other forms of media, whether it's video, AR, VR, whatever it is, other ways that may be more cost effective to teach people more efficiently. And I think the key there is if you make that investment out front, you would likely build a better society of people who then interact with that society. And let me just jump a little bit further. So, whether we like it or not, we're all living in the same time with other countries that are all at different levels of development. And I think that as other countries become more intelligent, more powerful, there's going to be a higher sense of competition where you'll want the populace to be elevated to some degree to be able to compete with those other countries. And I think one way you have to do that is build a strong foundation from the ground up and have people, having a better understanding of things, because there's a long time horizons there, right? By the time you're able to actually implement the ideas or participate in society, you could be looking at an 18 to 25 year lead time until you're at that point when you enter the workforce, when you start contributing. So, those things have to be implemented, I think, sooner than later if you've got competing countries that will potentially do that before you.
Sure. I just wanted to go back to a couple of things you said earlier. We all remember a good teacher, a favorite teacher we had. Just to unpack that a little bit, though, while that may be true, and I think that hopefully that's true for most people, I don't think there is universal agreement on what that best or who that best teacher was. And I think it's for a couple of different reasons, right? Different people have, I think, what was it? Howard Gardner talked about, was it 12 or 14 different learning styles, right? Mm-hmm. So different teachers are going to be better optimized or maybe a little bit more appealing to certain people, depending on what their learning style is. Like in your example, you talked about deconstruction of things, right? That certainly is useful and as a utility, but it's also demonstrative of a particular style of learning and a way of, drawing information from the world, mm-hmm. right? Which is neither better or worse than somebody that may learn more like, I don't know, via maybe mathematically or, through the consumption of different types of literature, et cetera, right? So I guess going back to the example of AI, I still come to where I see the possibility for disruption in education, edtech in particular, is not so much in the ability to stream best teachers or stream best content, right? I think that type of technology has already been with us for a while even if it may or may not be readily implemented. I'm actually wondering about where, you, Roy Peer, on a minute-by-minute basis, right, can be observed such that, right, all these different attributes about you in relationship to the knowledge that's being presented to you, right, can be observed and responded to in a way, whether that's, confusion in one instance or fatigue in another, or, boredom in another, or excitement in another, right? And in the manner by which the program itself, right, has very particular goals as an outcome, right? Pupil Roy Peer needs to be able to know the following at the end, right? But the manner by which, you get there on a kind of on a production-based and a reinforcement basis may change on a per pupil-to-pupil basis, right? And also, taking into consideration different immediate feedback loops within the education process, right? That there and again, a typical classroom environment, I can't be, or a human can have good classroom awareness, but they can't necessarily compute all sensory inputs on a per student basis and modify accordingly, is a thought.
Yeah, I mean, maybe today.
Yeah.
I also think there's, let's like break it down to the fundamentals, right? Which is, why do you go to school? Because you want to, or you're expected by society to learn things, right? So if the main goal here is to learn things, so then you can then participate in the world. And like you said earlier, there's different modes in which that people learn, right? Could be visual, could be auditory, could be, more hands-on, and whatever that is. So why in the hell do you have people that have never been vetted for this all forced into one way of doing it, right? And that could be because of the inefficiency of being able to not only gather that data, which would then call on the organizations to then act on it, which they may not have the ability to do because of the efficiencies and complexities there. But why isn't there a way that you can get that information and then put you into a specific learning style, right, in which you then follow, the more efficient way to learn? And then in the same vein, we were looking at, everyone is kind of funneled through a very similar time breakdown as far as when you're supposed to learn. Middle school, elementary school is from this grade to this grade, and middle school, high school, college, master's, whatever it is you're going after. And shouldn't it be a little bit different, whereas you're not constraining the time horizons to a semester or a calendar year, but it's more so on your progression? Is there a reason that somebody should waste 12 years of their time learning something in the current system when they could finish it in 4? Or if somebody needs more than 12 years, why can't they work at it for 15? So the fact that it's all tied to a similar system across the board, I think speaks more to the inefficiencies and of the system and those creating and adapting and developing out the system than it is the ability for each individual to learn. So what does society look at when you've got a 12-year-old who has a master's in physics, and then you have a 25-year-old who just graduated middle school? Well, it's going to be a little bit different, but it's really not that different if you extrapolate it out, because there's probably 30-year-olds who are more informed than people who are 60-year-olds. The only difference is, when do you allow that those discrepancies to really be prevalent in society? And it seems like only once you've hit a certain age of leaving school that it then becomes an open-ended question as to where you end up and where you exist, right? So I think there's some interesting things that could be done there. I definitely would want, maybe for selfish reasons, the Mozart of our time to be producing music and making music sooner so that more people could enjoy it. If it's, well, probably be all AI driven. But anyways, just calling out those people who have a proclivity to really develop out and an interest, and instead of bogging them down by a system that's limited to semesters and other structures, and also potentially bad teachers or good teachers, allowing it to be more of a organic and self-driven process. And you could see that being tested out on a small scale, and then if it works, and those people are able to then really show much greater results, then why wouldn't you then expand that out to the greater system? And then it's really up to the individual, and I think that's probably the best way. And the reason that the America is so great is that the individual has the ability to come from nothing, become something, or be something and become nothing. And the fragility of that is part of the beauty, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well said. Well said. Sorry. Sorry.
Good. So, what does a world look like when, you have people who can move at their own pace? And, does the world end because everyone's a superhuman and there's nobody to take out the trash or at a higher level govern a body or whatever it is? I mean, I think even within that you have kind of the human condition and maybe the way that people are, that even with all those pieces of information at their fingertip, it doesn't necessarily mean they'll turn out to be superhuman or take it to its full potential, right? You can open up your phone and read about the, biology of a caterpillar, right? Or you could open it up and look at people doing dances on a boardwalk, right? On some kind of social media. So, I mean, I think the beauty is you have the ability to choose what you'd like to do, and based on your kind of direction and initiatives. So, where do those kind of directions and outlooks on life come from, right? And that you could say that starts at home. That's your parents, your environment, your influence, your siblings, the world around you, the information you're taking in, the expectation of society, right? It's like, what was it? I think the 4-minute mile was something that was said to be impossible, but then once somebody had done it, people started achieving it at a much higher frequency. So it's one of those things where you may not even know the potential that you have, and you stop. There's also a handful of examples of people who, let's say, strike it big in business. They have a great exit. They have a business that becomes wildly successful, and then they spend the rest of their time on the beach, where you might say, why would someone who's spent all this time figuring out how to do something extremely well, as far as an economic level, that they gather so much cash or influence or power or whatever, and then they just decide to throw in the towel? So it's one of those things where you could say that that's kind of silly, but the person could say, I've worked 20 years, 80 hours a week, and I'm kind of sick of it, and I want to do something else, or I want to be more passive and invest in, different ways of kind of engaging with society. But there's you could also say that the incentive structure has been removed because, you've essentially, let's say you've built something just for the scale of things that is $1 billion enterprise. There's potentially no reason to open up a lemonade stand on the corner, because you're only going to be, your potential there in that vehicle is light, right? So you could also look at some of the biggest hedge funds and allocators of capital that are dealing in the trillions of dollars of money that has to be distributed and return for pension funds and things of that nature. And there's only so much you can invest $1 trillion in, right?
Yeah.
So it kind of, the success itself is also somewhat limiting, if not from an egotistical standpoint, just a efficiency standpoint as well.
Sure. Coming back in a different way to kind of zoom out on, again, specifically the potential for AI in education, though, it is interesting to imagine scenarios in which AI could further hyper-accelerate human development, not reduce it. And that is, for example, right, when we talk about, again, what kind of is the goal, right, as you said, right? It would be interesting through a selective process, whether it be, AI-assisted interest inventory, personal interest, what are you interested in doing, right, later in life, right? and having so many years be feeding that back even as you're learning a core, right? It would seem to me that AI might be very well placed to, let's say, for example, like one of your interests is, I want to be an astronaut on Mars, or, I want to, I think space is one example of where on a predictive basis, launch technologies are becoming more accessible, cheaper, right? Space is quote unquote opening up, right? It would be interesting to think about AI systems that are able to, similar to bring it back to, when we talked about GPT and ChatGPT, taking these large language models of available data and constructing lessons from it, right? And these lessons might be kind of unique, not so much that if you're a NASA astronaut, you're not running through certain curriculums, but they're kind of unique in the context of how do you fully teach different fundamentals to, say, a 12 or a 14-year-old, right? Above and beyond some sort of, generalized introductory to space exploration enrichment experience, which certainly has a place, right? But it's not necessarily a fast-tracked AI-enabled, right? When you brought it before, the 12-year-old that, say, has a master's degree, right? Why not a 16-year-old that quite frankly has from an educational level anyway, and maybe even a simulation level, a comparable skill set of a 55-year-old astronaut, right? Mm-hmm. The only difference is they have not yet been in space, right? But we could all agree that's perhaps an optimized beginning if that, in fact, is the career trajectory of said individual, right?
Right, absolutely. So, and I think that then speaks to the importance of experience as the teacher. And I think, anyone who has gone through any type of schooling, you're learning fundamentals and concepts and things of that nature that are the underlying kind of basis for then what you might be doing in the field. But when you get in the field, it's, you're going to learn a lot of the things there. And that's why you don't go from being a graduate to a principal in a firm because you don't necessarily understand, at least within the framework in front of you, what it takes to then do that, right? You could learn the fundamentals of business and then go and then apprentice somebody as an MBA who would be a CEO or something, and then learn through experience the nuances of those organizations or those realities. But I mean, like what you're bringing up is, what does a master's degree? How does that adapt itself to the world in front of you? And I think it maybe prepares you to understand some fundamentals, so you're not kind of thrown in blind. But then the experience itself is what teaches you. But then you could also say, well, why are you just learning the fundamentals during that time? Why don't you also get experience? And people do. They get internships and they have jobs in school that gives them kind of a more real world kind of understanding of the things that are going on. But, later when they get into the field. But, why do you have to learn in that way? And is there a non-risk, non-consequence-based way to then learn experience in a non-active scenario? So, let's say you're thrown in your first year of whatever subject you're learning, and you run this hypothetical but real, but what feels real company and making decisions, and then you see in real time, because it could extrapolate out what happens if you were to make certain decisions. So let's say you were made CEO of a hypothetical company that had a supply chain issue, and you were then presented with options of different ways you could take it, and then very quickly you could make those decisions, and then it would fast forward and show you how those decisions would play out. But you would actually live through some of those outcomes, right? And maybe that's the test, right? Because when you get into the real world, you've got to make those decisions. And some things, like let's say, for instance, what happened with the pandemic, some of those things you definitely. Wait, there's more. To listen to the next part of this episode, please follow the platform catalog.